Good morning. These days, we're working pretty closely with a number of Oklahoma employers that are trying to decide what to do about the issue of vaccination when it comes to their workforce and their employees. So I think this has been triggered by a number of events. We've seen a spike in the Delta variant and some breakthrough infections. Recently, the FDA gave full approval to the Pfizer vaccine. That has a number of employers looking at the vaccination issue again. And most recently, the U.S. military has announced that they're going to require active military to be vaccinated this fall. So I think a number of those factors are coming into play, and many of you are reappraising what to do when it comes to vaccination. So Courtney Brew and I thought it would be helpful to review, give a kind of an overview of the kind of issues employers are facing and provide some information. Good morning, Courtney.
Good morning, Charlie.
Okay, so let's start with the tough one. Let's talk about employers that are trying to decide whether or not to have mandatory vaccines, requiring their employees as a condition of employment to be vaccinated. So let's start with that question, if you would. Can an Oklahoma employer require, as a condition of people working at their place of employment, require them to be vaccinated for COVID?
Absolutely. You absolutely can. There's not a state or federal law that prohibits you from doing that.
Okay. And so let's assume an employer has decided that they want to have mandatory vaccination for employees. There's got to be some administration involved. Can we ask employees if we have that mandatory vaccination policy in place? Can we ask employees they were vaccinated, and can we require them to prove that they're vaccinated?
Yes, you can ask the question. You can look at any employee that you have and ask, have you been vaccinated? And you can ask for proof of that. And Charlie and I agree that you should be a little flexible here. So if someone wants to show you a card, that's great. A photo of a card, a doctor's note, anything like that. But you can request documentation to back up a claim that someone is vaccinated.
If you're having that mandatory vaccine.
If you have a mandatory policy in place, correct.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked about employers deciding to have mandatory vaccines for their existing employees. Let's say I'm an employer and say, yeah, I'm going to have my existing employees be vaccinated and prove they're vaccinated. What about new hires or applicants, people who are coming to me and seeking employment? How do we handle that?
Right. So if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, you've got to treat everybody equally, right? So Charlie and I agree that you probably need to bring this topic up sooner rather than later in your hiring process. There's probably a couple different ways that you can go here. You could let somebody know that we have a mandatory vaccination policy as part of the sort of pre-hire or interview process. You might not want to ask a question of an applicant, are you vaccinated? But you want to give notice that, yes, this is here. If you want to come on board with us, this is something you're going to be subject to.
You know, the analogy I give to a lot of employers is it's like if you have a drug testing policy. I think most employers that have drug testing policies, they're going to tell applicants, hey, you need to know as a condition of employment, you're going to be tested for drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. Okay. You might not ask anybody, how would you test right now if we tested you? But you want to give the notice and then let the notice have its impact.
Or you don't ask them what their favorite drug is.
Not at the pre-employment stage, no.
Now here's a curveball I got last week from an employer. Because it's a touchy subject. I mean, employers are struggling whether to have a mandatory vaccine policy or not. And I had an employer last week say, you know what I think I'm going to do is I'm not going to require existing employees to be vaccinated, but new hires, I'm going to require all my new hires to be vaccinated going forward. What are your thoughts on that approach?
I don't recommend that. I don't think that passes muster under our anti-discrimination laws or under the OSHA guidance. The goal here is to keep people in the workplace safe, and people can present a risk of COVID, whether they're brand new to your work site or whether they've been with you for 15 years. So we need to treat everybody the same going forward.
So obviously, in this process where I can ask, if I've got a mandatory policy, I can ask whether you're vaccinated, and I can ask you to prove it to me. Yes. We're going to be getting information as employers. How do employers treat that information about vaccinations, and any practical recommendations on handling it?
Sure. So that information is protected, confidential medical information under the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is the type of stuff that you have to put in a separate file, separate and apart from the rest of a personnel file. And it needs to be very tightly controlled. You don't want to disseminate this to people who don't have a reason to know. So be careful with it. Keep it confidential. Keep that net very close.
Yeah, and when you say keep the net close, one of the things I suggest to employers, centralize that process. The information gathering, as much as you can. I know you may have multiple locations, but if we can centralize the vaccination information, questioning and maintaining, that helps us keep it confidential.
It helps you keep it confidential, and it helps you be consistent. If you can have just a small group or even an individual decision maker, then that person can see all of these scenarios come through and help ensure that you're being consistent, which is another ultimate goal.
Let's say an employer has decided to go forward with mandatory vaccines for both existing employees and employees that are coming on board, new hires. Is it required, or is that employer required to consider exceptions? In other words, employees come forward and say, hey, I know I'm supposed to have a vaccine, but I'd like to have an exception to this policy.
Yes, there are two primary exceptions that you'll have to consider. One is an employee that may have some type of medical condition, that possibly even a disability. And the other would be a sincerely held religious belief. And you need to consider those on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. We get questions periodically of give me a good form or give me a checklist. And I couldn't agree with you more. You really have to address both the medical request for an exception to the vaccination or the religious belief exception on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't lend itself necessarily to a checklist.
I agree. I'm not a huge proponent of just relying on a form to do this process. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all type scenario. But what you have to understand is there will be a dialogue here. So you're going to be talking with people about sensitive issues, and you've got to feel comfortable with that and confident with that, because that's our duty as employers, is to have that interactive process. You're probably familiar with that phrase from ADA land. That's what you're doing here. You're going through the interactive process to see if someone needs an accommodation. The accommodation in this case might be an exemption from your mandatory vaccination policy.
Yeah. So the other thing I've run across is, employers say, well, I'm with you on I understand I've got an obligation to consider a medical request for an exception to mandatory vaccination. I understand I have to consider an exception to mandatory vaccination for a sincerely held religious belief. But what about employees that say, just from a philosophical or political reason? And this is a flashpoint that unfortunately you all are dealing with generally. Is that a recognized exception, the kind of philosophical or political oppositions to vaccines?
Right. So it's not, and I realize it's very easy for us to say that and very difficult for you guys to administer, but there is no exception that must be granted on the basis of a social belief or a political ideology, strictly religion and medical issues.
Okay. It is going to be a hot issue. Whatever you decide about vaccination in your workplace, one of the things to keep in mind, and the message that can't be said too often from an employer standpoint, whatever you decide on vaccinations, you need to impress upon your workforce, this isn't political, this isn't philosophical, this is about health and safety, and I as an employer get to control health and safety concerns in my workplace. That's my right?
Right. Not only do you get to control it, you have to. OSHA and different laws require you to take steps to protect your workers, and that's what you're trying to do here. Certainly not trying to single anybody out based on their beliefs, but it's a collective unit, and you've got to take action to keep the unit as safe as possible.
All right. So I have to be ready, if I have a mandatory vaccine policy, to consider medical exception requests, sincerely held religious belief requests. What am I entitled to do, or what should I do when someone says, hey, I have a medical reason for not getting a vaccine, or I have a religious belief that prevents me from getting a vaccine? What kind of inquiry, what kind of information can I require?
Right. So you get to ask for enough information for you to do two things. One, gauge whether or not a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief exists, and also to figure out, what does that mean? What is the impact on you? What type of accommodation might you need? Why can you not be vaccinated? So again, touchy conversation that you get to have. You can ask for documentation during these conversations. If we're dealing with a medical issue that's not open and obvious, which these won't be typically, then you get to ask for documentation from a treating physician, something that explains to you what the condition is and why the condition is inconsistent with obtaining a COVID-19 vaccination.
Right. So let me ask you two follow-ups, because I've run across this in the last couple of weeks. What about someone who presents a letter from a physician or healthcare provider that simply says, Charlie can't tolerate a vaccine. Is that enough? Can I dig deeper if I'm the employer?
So, and you and I have discussed this. I dig deeper. I typically recommend to dig deeper. There's two things that I'm really looking for. One, I want to make sure that we're getting information from a healthcare provider that's actually treating for this condition. So a letter from your dentist that you have COPD is not helpful to me
Right.
in this situation, right?
Right.
So you want to get the right person giving you the information. And then I need a little more about why this condition is inconsistent with a vaccine.
Okay. So again, another experience the last couple of weeks, we're seeing employees present, for lack of a better term, form letters from spiritual groups or groups that describe themselves as churches, may come from absolutely legitimate sources and legitimate beliefs, may be part of a cottage industry where you can get these for $12 donation online. So how much inquiry when an employee comes to the employer and says, I'd like to have an exception to your mandatory vaccine because of my sincerely held religious beliefs. Here's something that supports that. What are your thoughts on how much digging can you do?
So frankly, my thoughts have changed a little bit during the pandemic. This is an area where typically we wouldn't dig in too much. We would be very deferential, but we are seeing a lot of these form letters. And I don't know about you, but what we're seeing a lot of, or my clients are seeing a lot of, is somebody that's very vocal about how they feel about the vaccine from a social or political standpoint. And that is not getting them where they want to go. And suddenly we get a form letter or we fall back on a religious grounds. I think you got to consider the circumstances. So if you're in that scenario, you've got reason to believe that, well, maybe it's not exactly a sincerely held religious belief. I think you can dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
You could certainly have a conversation with someone about explain the basis of your belief to me. You know, it's always been sort of taboo to say, give me a letter from your pastor, documenting that you're at church every weekend.
Right.
You don't want to go that far. But if you have reason to be suspicious, or if you are receiving a form letter that isn't necessarily tailored to the Joe that's asking for an exemption, I think you've got to dig a little bit deeper because you're wanting to limit the number of exemptions as much as possible to keep the workforce safe. So you've got to pass more muster than just, I printed this off the internet. Here it is.
And, that brings up something I had a client run across. They had several employees that presented letters from a church in California. And what about asking them when they first became associated with this church?
Has always been fair game, continues to be fair game.
Okay. What about researching the background of that church and finding, in my example, this client went on, found a series of YouTube sites that kind of brought into question how sincerely held these religious beliefs were or related to any sort of religion. Is that kosher?
That's totally kosher. Keep in mind this way, you're asking about the basis for a religious belief the same way that you would ask for a basis of a medical condition, right? So you get to get that information. Don't feel hesitant to ask those questions because then you'll present as you're doing something wrong. You get to have this conversation. You need to have this conversation. You've got to get this info.
Well, and I just want to point out how cool is it that we use the word kosher twice when we were talking about sincerely held religious beliefs.
Nice job.
Okay. Another issue, have you run across situations in which pregnant employees or employees who are breastfeeding have raised the issue of medical concerns?
Yes, we're seeing a lot of this. And this is difficult because we don't have as much sort of scientific data about the impact of vaccines on pregnant women that are breastfeeding, women that are actively in fertility treatment, so they're receiving medical treatment for fertility. My advice is always, these are conditions, maybe not disabilities, but these are underlying medical conditions, and so we need to have this same type of dialogue. And I will say that I've seen really great doctor's notes that discuss the lack of available information and the concerns that the patient has, and the fact that because we don't know a lot, perhaps it would make sense not to vaccinate in this scenario. And when you reach that point, it falls back on the employer. Is there a way that we can accommodate that? And that will depend on your workplace, the options that are available for this employee to continue to perform essential functions. So when we're talking about individualized consideration, this is an area where you've got to have a dialogue, you've got to find out information, and you've got to consider every possible alternative out there.
Well, I think a lot of our viewers are familiar with that interactive process you've talked about in the context of the ADA and disability. let's assume, and considering a potential accommodation, let's assume that you've done your digging and I've presented enough information that I've got a bona fide medical reason for not getting a vaccine, although you have a mandatory vaccine policy, or I've established a sincerely held religious belief. What sort of accommodations do you see employers considering when somebody does request that exception for either religious or medical reasons, or what are you suggesting to employers?
So creativity is important here, and there's no sort of limit on what may be reasonable for you. The common things that we're seeing are, okay, then you continue to mask up, you continue to socially distance yourself. Telework may be an option. Putting somebody on a different schedule, so maybe they're not interacting with as many employees as they usually would. Frankly, a lot of sort of modifying your daily routine. So usually you sit here, we're going to put you in this office, and you can't use this break room, but you can go here. A lot of things like that, sort of structuring the workplace. But the goal being, keep this person isolated as much as possible and do what you can to protect the rest of the workforce.
Well, and we're protecting not only the rest of the workforce in that situation, that individual who has not been vaccinated presumably is more susceptible, perhaps.
Exactly, you're protecting that person too. And one thing we should probably address too is you may find yourself in a situation where you really can't roll out some type of accommodation to keep the person at their job. And you may not have another place to reassign someone to. So if you've got someone that's not vaccinated and you've gone through this process and you determine that they pose a threat either to others by not being vaccinated or not following any other sort of protocol, or maybe they're at risk for those same reasons, you've always got to consider the possibility that you might not be able to keep them on the job, keep them in the workplace.
Do you ever suggest, or have you heard other employers for unvaccinated people who have qualified for exception require periodic testing?
Yes, that is something that we've recommended more recently, and that varies based on what the certain circumstances are, but we do have people that we have made a requirement that, yes, I'm going to need you to submit to periodic testing on a regular basis before I can let you physically enter the workplace.
And are your employers that you're dealing with, are they paying for that test? And are they paying for the employees' time to take that test?
We're definitely paying for the time to take the test. Whether or not we're paying for the actual testing itself, it has varied.
Right.
We've got some employers that are willing to pay that. We've got some employers that haven't been as willing to pay that. And so that cost has fallen on the employee. And at this point in time, we don't have anything to suggest that that's inappropriate in any way.
What about, here at McAfee, this spring, we made available vaccines for whoever was interested in having a vaccine. And we brought in a clinic, and we did it here in this conference room, I think, that we're seated
I think it
at.
wasn't here, right?
If I'm not mistaken. So absolutely voluntary, but we brought in the clinicians and the nurses. If you have a mandatory vaccine policy, does it matter whether you are providing the vaccine yourself as an employer, or whether you're saying, hey, Courtney, you got to have the vaccine, go get it from CVS or go get it from Walgreens or go get it from the health department and just bring us a card? Is there a difference in that approach, and why?
It does make a difference. So if you bring someone in, you bring in a third party and you give them the space and you allow your folks to take advantage of that, then that person's operating as your agent, just as if it was you. Maybe your CEO sitting there jabbing people with the vaccine. It's the same thing. So it does trigger all of these sort of pre-employment inquiry regulations. It limits the ability to ask questions prior to screening, and it also puts you in possession of confidential information that you need to treat appropriately under the ADA.
The question I've got, I can't, other than being able to roll out mandatory vaccines maybe faster, more effectively, it seems like if you're an employer and you're going to require vaccinations, you take on another level of responsibility and potential liability if you are administering it, as opposed to asking people to go get it from some other source and simply prove that you're vaccinated. What are your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely right. I mean, the only answer to that question is yes. When we're talking a mandatory program, it is another layer for you.
Okay. You've talked about mandatory vaccines. Let's switch gears now, okay? One thing on vaccinations, if you decide it's not mandatory, I think it's really important, even in a non-mandatory setting, if vaccination is entirely voluntary, it's still important to spend some time in educating your employees on vaccinations, their safety, their effectiveness, that sort of thing. I mean, because I think, and this maybe, I don't know, it maybe applies to mandatory as well. I think getting information in people's hands, this is a hot button. Maybe it soothes a little bit of that. Maybe it encourages people who are on the fence of whether to get a vaccine or not. One of the things I would ask you to consider, if you're going to take that step on educating employees, I think it's more valuable if it's not coming from you, the employer, or the HR person. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I mean, there's a lot of services out there that you can take advantage of. These governmental agencies give you great resources. But I think if you're asking people, if you're requiring it, if you're asking it, it's fair to provide information so people can fully understand, what do you want? What are you asking me to do? What does that involve?
Yeah.
Let me learn about it. I think it's totally appropriate.
And if you've elected to have it not mandatory, simply voluntary, education is part of that process too. There's a lot of misinformation, getting experts, third parties rather than somebody in your company or in your workplace to kind of shine a light on that. Maybe it breaks down some of the emotions a little bit. Maybe it does convince people to consider a vaccine that they wouldn't consider otherwise.
What else can you do to try to get your people to vaccinate?
Well, in a voluntary setting, it's absolutely okay to offer incentives. Some of the, if you're vaccinated, if you choose to vaccinate, entirely voluntary, but if you choose to vaccinate, you can, you get a $100 gift card at Starbucks. You'll get an extra day of PTO. I'm trying to think, what other incentives have you seen that have been effective and are lawful?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen cash incentives. We've seen, we'll put an extra day in your bank for you to use down the road, not for a vaccination purpose. I've got a lot of clients that are incentivizing the vaccine. I think more than I ever thought I would see.
Yeah.
I think it's just a fairly common approach right now.
Well, and one of the things that you're going to have to face, if you do have a voluntary vaccination policy and it has an incentive component, what do you do about people that have already had the vaccine? I mean, my thought is, if you're going to have an incentive for vaccines, even people that already have received the vaccine should get that same incentive. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a difficult thing to administer. But what we're seeing is this increase in incentives halfway through the vaccination process. So
Right.
You've got a big chunk of your workforce that already did it, and now you're rewarding this segment of the workforce for doing it. It seems to just make sense. And most of my clients are opting to go that way, to sort of retroactively provide the incentive.
Same here. And I've had people not think of that issue, and it gets brought to their attention when an employee says, well, I would have been better off just holding off on the vaccine to get the $100 Starbucks card.
Right.
So that's the other practical issue.
So what do you do about people that may have an exemption from a vaccination mandatory policy, or that they can't get vaccinated even under a voluntary policy?
So that's a struggle, because the EEOC has said, if you've got an incentive program and somebody has it can prove a bona fide medical exception or a bona fide or sincerely held religious belief, you need to make arrangements for them to get a comparable incentive. In other words, they shouldn't be penalized and not eligible for an incentive if they have a legitimate health condition or a sincerely held religious belief. The things I've run into, I have a lot of employers that simply say, look, from an administration standpoint, if someone establishes a medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief that would otherwise not make them eligible for the incentive, this voluntary incentive, I'm going to go ahead and give it to them.
Right.
I've had other employers, and this is lawful, so that's a lawful approach. Another lawful approach is I've had employers say, well, I'm going to have them do something else. I'm going to have them, maybe I tie it to masking, maybe I tie it to periodic testing. Any other examples you've run into of someone to qualify for an incentive in a voluntary setting?
So we've sort of struggled to answer that question or provide alternate scenarios. But one thing we have seen clients do, and it's perfectly lawful, is to require someone to do a little more research, educating themselves. Here's some more materials educating you about vaccines. If you'll review these, then we'll go ahead and give you the incentive too. So
Okay.
Anything you can think of, there's nothing that's really been tabled there.
You know, the one issue I think that sometimes gets missed is we've seen some pretty healthy or generous incentives. And
Lately. Yeah.
yes, yeah, I mean a couple of days PTO or a couple $100, whatever. I mean something that's pretty significant. One thing that you need to be careful about is if you as the employer are providing the actual vaccine, making it available, or your agent is making it available, your limits, there are caps on how much your incentive can be. There are no limits on your incentives if you're saying, hey, Courtney, you make the decision on whether you not get a vaccine, but if you, from a third source, you at the health department or wherever, but if you bring in your card, I'm going to give you 2 days PTO. I don't think there's any real limit under those circumstances for incentive.
No, I don't think so. But then how do you require those people to prove that they've been vaccinated at the CVS?
I think your instructions about the ability to ask the question for a vaccine, proof of vaccine, and ask for documentation, whether it's a card or a doctor's note, I think that's all applies to a voluntary vaccine program to establish an incentive. Or the other reason you're entitled, even in a voluntary vaccination environment, to ask me to prove that I got the vaccine is you may make my situation different. You may make me take periodic tests. You may make me mask up more. You may have me work remotely. You may have me work in a different area or different hours. So all that, I think all the rules or suggestions you made on mandatory vaccination policies apply when it comes to voluntary. You can still ask whether I'm vaccinated and still require me to prove it. All the rules and guidelines Courtney gave in terms of confidentiality and tips on how to keep that information very confidential and only accessible to those people who have a right and need to know, they still apply whether it's a mandatory or voluntary system.
What if an employer wants to help your family members get vaccinated too?
Right, and we did that at McAfee. We made I think it was, my recall was if somebody was on our health plan, a family member, non-employee, they were eligible to come up and get a vaccine if they wanted to. And that's perfectly okay as long as it's clear there is no ramification or issue for the employee, whether or not any of their family members get a vaccination or not. The information is still confidential, obviously. And you're going to want to have those family members that show up on their own, absolutely voluntary. We're going to have them sign an authorization reinforcing the idea that it's going to be maintained confidentially, and it's entirely voluntary on their part, and there's not going to be any ramification for their family member who is an employee.
Right.
So that's it ties in, I think, exactly with just general most everybody's health plans, if you want to go that route.
Right.
What have you seen in terms of OSHA activity? I mean, we talked about mandatory vaccination, voluntary vaccination. What about what's going on with OSHA right now?
Okay, so OSHA has this general duty clause that applies to employers that you have to provide your workforce with a workplace that's safe from certain types of threats. One of them can be contracting some type of an illness. And that has always been a thing. That is not new. It's an old thing that applies equally to COVID-19. And basically what the general duty clause says is you got to do something. I mean, you have to protect people in some way. You can't look in that statute and see you have to mask, you have to socially distance, you have to do these things. You have to do something that's reasonable for your workplace. And so OSHA has been, as it always does, it has been sort of administering and enforcing that requirement. And so what I've seen is we've had a couple of clients that have gotten letters from OSHA. Typically, an employee has complained that they don't feel safe in the workplace. Maybe they don't feel like the employer has taken enough steps to keep people safe in the workplace. And so we've gotten a letter that basically says, this is what we've heard. What are you actually doing? We want to see your policies. We want to know what your day-to-day practices are.
Right.
It's very informal. I have not had any OSHA inspector come on site.
No on-site inspection.
No on-site. I haven't seen that. And then each instance, we have sent back up a letter with some copies of our policies and said, this is what we're doing. Here's where we can prove that up. Here's the communications to our employees about it. And in some instances, we never heard a thing back.
Right.
And in others, we heard, hey, that's great, keep it up. Here's what we're really looking at. Be sure to keep that component up and going until, you feel like it's okay to pull it back. How about you? What have you seen?
Yeah, the letters the employers I've talked to have received, typically there's been someone who's tested positive, so there's an exposure issue, and other employees are concerned that the employer didn't take the proper steps on advising people,
Like tracing, okay.
contact, perhaps quarantining people who had contact with it. Both of the most recent OSHA letters were triggered by that event, and we followed exactly the same path you described. I think the best defense or response is if you as an employer are able to demonstrate your practices and protocol follow the CDC guidelines and follow the OSHA guidelines, I think you're home free. I mean, I also think it's one of these situations, like a lot of OSHA circumstances, they're really looking for the big violators, the employers that are not responsible, aren't taking this seriously, or ignoring the guidelines.
Right.
So
Right.
if you're following the guidelines, if you're considerate about that, you're publicizing that to your employees, and you're acting responsibly. That doesn't mean we don't make some mistakes. That doesn't mean we're
Right.
perfect. I think you're going to be okay when you get those OSHA inquiries.
Right. And that's where the guidelines really come into play. Everybody talks about OSHA guidelines and CDC guidelines. You can protect yourself by following those guidelines. You can protect yourself if an unvaccinated employee wants to claim that they were discriminated against because they were treated differently. Well, I was following the guidelines.
Right.
Or you get that OSHA letter and they're like, what did you do? And you say, I followed the CDC, the latest CDC guidelines. That's where that really comes into play.
Right.
I think we talk a lot about the guidelines and we don't really focus on how they sync up, why they're helpful for you. They're actually helpful for you to follow. If you're doing what those guidelines say, you're in pretty good shape if you get a letter like this.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely on the money. I mean, I think the guidelines you get from the EEOC and OSHA and the CDC, the ability to point to those, it protects you legally. It protects you legally from claims by individual employees who feel like they've been treated unfairly or unlawfully. It protects you from health concerns, trying to maintain a healthy work environment. It's really kind of a double protection.
Yeah,
So,
and I think now more than ever, it's did you try, not did you bat 1,000.
right.
You're going to have employees that disregard these policies. Did you take steps to monitor that, to enforce your policies? You're not going to be perfect, like Charlie said the whole time, but it's the steps, it's the effort that's
Absolutely.
really going to protect you if you get called out for it.
So closing points, give us a little bit of a roadmap on best practices on this whole vaccination issue.
Yeah, sure. So I think you've got to stay informed. Right now, in the last couple of weeks, months, feels like we've been backsliding a little bit. Our guidelines have changed some. You've got to stay informed. None of us want to slip backwards, but if we are, then we have to re-examine our protocols and make sure that we're using the most recent guidelines, that we know what they are, that we're putting them into place in our workforce. Decide if you're going to have some type of a vaccination policy. It doesn't have to be mandatory. Do you want to incentivize that in some way? But whatever your policies are in terms of vaccination or protocols in the workplace, make sure that you're conveying those to your employees on a regular basis. Best practice would be to have that in writing. I just had a conversation with a client and they're like, oh, we got the new policy based on the new CDC guidelines, and then they changed and they went back. It takes time to roll out a very formal policy. You can email your employees this information and,
Right.
and that passes muster. So don't feel like you have to go through all your formal steps. The world is changing rapidly, and whatever it takes for you to keep up with the changing guidelines is what you need to do.
Well, and to your point, when you're making decisions about what sort of vaccination policy you want to put in place, whether it's mandatory, whether it's absolutely voluntary, or anything you've got in mind, I think it's important to take a pretty individualized, you talk about updating, individualized view of what's happening in your community, what's happening right now in Tulsa County. We should be responding to that, and we should be saying, hey, here's why we made this decision. Here's what's happening in the hospitals. Here's what's happening with the infection rates. It's also, I had an employer maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago decide they wanted to go a different route on vaccinations because they had a spike in their workplace. So again, Courtney's idea to keep updated on the guidelines, very important. Also, keep updated on your circumstance when it comes to infections in your community or in your workplace.
That's right.
What else should we be considering?
So you've got to train sort of your frontline supervisors, right? I mean, they're going to be the most effective source for you to enforce your policies. So they've got to either enforce it in each instance or let you know that we have an enforcement issue. You can't give an inch, right? You've got to maintain your policies and make sure that your employees are following their policies. So training your supervisors on that, making sure that they know you've got their back when they're having to enforce these policies, I think that's really important right now.
Well, and it is a hot button issue, and your frontline supervisors, they're going to be in the crosshairs. They may be refereeing some arguments or hard feelings between employees. So arming them with that information, I think, is important. The whole education of the workplace. What do you recommend for employers in terms of putting out their information about the availability of either an exception for health reasons or for religious belief reasons for vaccination, mandatory vaccination?
Right. I mean, your employees need to know what to do.
Right.
If I'm sitting here and I think that I have a reason not to get the vaccine and it's important, and now you're either making it mandatory for me to get it or you're incentivizing me or having this voluntary vaccination drive, you've got to provide a pathway for somebody to know how to come to you. The way you can do that, I think, varies. I've got some clients that say, if you think you have a disability or a religious belief that justifies an exemption, then reach out to us. I've got other people whose policies just say, if you have concerns about receiving the vaccine, reach out to this person. But there needs to be a contact person and a channel to get that information. And again, keep that role as small as possible so that you can ensure that you're being consistent when you get various different types of requests.
I heard a point made by an employer yesterday in a phone call that I hadn't really thought about on this issue. They were having some concerns about the bona fide nature of some of the religious documentation. And the point she made is she wanted to make sure the employees understood that there would be an inquiry, there would be a review. And, upon reflection, I thought, that's not a bad idea to let people know, we're just not taking doctor's notes and letters, form letters from religious organizations or spiritual organizations in Hawaii. We're not taking those on face value. Well, maybe there's some value to telling employees, hey, we got this process. We're going to respect health conditions. We're going to respect sincerely held religious beliefs, but we're going to administer and monitor that in a very realistic and fair way.
And I think it helps, too, to educate your employees about where are we headed? Like, what's the goal here? So if somebody comes to you and they claim a sincerely held religious belief, and the only way to protect them and protect your workforce if they're not vaccinated is to exclude them from it. I think there's a misunderstanding there from some employees that are requesting exemptions that, if I can prove up this exemption, at the end of the day, I don't have to wear a mask or I don't have to get vaccinated. Well, that may be true, but you also may not be able to come in and be physically present in the workforce and do your job. So you may be looking at a situation where you're out on leave or you're gone altogether. So I have a couple of clients that have done a really good job of conveying that message, and suddenly we're able to reach a common ground, or we're able to, move on down the road. So I think there is a fundamental misconception from a lot of the workforce that if I can prove up an exemption, that's the end of it. I now get to be here and not subject to the policy. And that may not be the case.
Right. Well, this no question, this is a timely subject. It's one with a lot of emotion. It's got, there are going to be disputes. There are going to be arguments. We hope that today has been helpful in getting you at a point where you're sensitive to the issues and hopefully can navigate them. Thank you for your time.